Good evening to all from India. This is Abhivardhan from GLA, and here we are with the flagship panel for today for GLACON 2022. Let me summarize what happened in this conference in 2 minutes so that we just begin with the panel right away. We had an interesting lecture by Justice J.R. Midha from Delhi High Court, who actually delivered his views on ADR. Then we had a panel following it, following which we had a panel on Russia-Ukraine crisis, following which we had a panel, actually not, I'll not call a panel, a dialogue on India's sustainable economy. Today we had two interesting discussions, one on environment law and regulation and another one on diplomacy and regulatory tech. Now this one is the flagship panel for tonight, because we have some really amazing speakers and I'll say policy analysts of their own in their own right. So let me introduce everyone, and uh, I'll be very happy to introduce all the panelists uh, in this session. So we have Jyotsna Mehra. She's a young leader at the Pacific Forum. We have Akshob, who is the visiting fellow at ORF. We have Rishabh Vats, who is the visiting professor at NMIMS Mumbai. We have Surya Kainagaonkar, who you must have seen in our past episodes as well. He's a geopolitics analyst. And we have a special surprise guest, Richard, who is also a geopolitics analyst. So we have our best people in that sense who we have in the discourse on Indian foreign policy and India's avenues into 2030 when it comes to strategic and competitive autonomy. So welcome to all for GLACON, and let's begin with the discussion. So let me ask this first question to Rishabh on the perspective of Indian foreign policy to lay a foundation, and then the panelists can, of course, add their views accordingly. So again, welcome to everyone. So, as we know that the Indo-Pacific is an emerging construct, and as the panel suggests by the title, it was about India, Europe, and East Asia, and their shared competitive and strategic autonomies in their sense, what they have, how they're seeing the developments, and so forth. So, to lay some foundation, and maybe I would say in a clockwise manner, the panelists can share their views. Um, what can we see as far as the short term challenges in this decade of 2020 to 2030, as we are in kind of a post COVID situation, in my view, although still there are some sixth wave or fourth wave coming in various countries. But seeing that, what is your view on the Indo-Pacific construction when it comes to these particular three regional blocks, or let's say theaters of geopolitics, which is India, Europe, and East Asia? So, Rishabh, I think you can begin with the Indian foreign policy perspective, and I think then our panelists in a clockwise manner can give their views, please.
Hi, I hope I'm audible. Uh, yeah, so good to join everybody here. Again, so 2020, 2030, okay, that's a long time, of course, but I think from an Indian perspective, I think you already see some of the contradictions emerge. I won't say contradiction, but then they are framed like contradiction, like in terms of foreign policy choices, that will face India in the Indo-Pacific, right? And I think the Russian-Ukraine conflict or the tensions in Europe have actually brought some of these contradictions, or let's say, contradictions in front of us. One thing, I mean, if you remember when Indo-Pacific as a construct, was coming out, in the early days, a lot of people actually were talking about, how, you know, how do we actually coordinate our interests, right? Because our conception of what was Indo-Pacific was actually very different. So, there were a lot of talk about from Indian analysts that, the American or the Western conception of Indo-Pacific actually is very limited to, the Pacific part and not the Indo-Pacific part, or at least not on the Western Ocean region, right? And I would say to some extent, uh, Indo-Pacific was a very, maritime sort of a concept. And to some extent, I didn't think that a lot of Indian policymakers, especially at that time, uh, expected that we'll have to make certain choices, or we'll be met with certain tough choices with regards to what happens with Russia and China. I think on that front, I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges. How we actually, if we want to move closer to the West, right? How do we actually correlate that, or kind of, make sense of that with also kind of forwarding or at least maintaining a kind of a cordial relationship with Russia. So that kind of polarization of interest that you're seeing right now, I think that's going to be one of our biggest challenges. Um, of course, on in general, not just talking about the Indo-Pacific part, etc., or strategic autonomy aspect. I think one of the biggest challenge would be our economy, right? At the end of the day, it is basically those engines have to move forward, and we can't lag behind, as we can see. I mean, out of all this talk about collective security architectures, etc., ultimately you see that countries, when faced with tough choices, when faced with troops amassing on their borders, I mean, ultimately you can call for immediate help, but ultimately it's your national strength at the end of the day which is going to matter, which is going to provide that security for you, which is going to enable you to make certain choices which are tough, right? So I think on that front, I would say, from an Indian perspective, I think some of these so-called contradictions are emerging, and it's very interesting to have these debates right now, because I think there's a lot of talk about non-alignment movement being dead, etc. I mean, again, I'm not saying that this is a kind of a non-alignment movement or whatever is being reborn again. All I'm saying is that those kind of debates are coming out in the front again and again. So I think though that I think will be the biggest challenge to my mind.
So who's next clockwise?
Sure. So I think Jyotsna would like to share her views. Please begin. Yeah.
Sure, thanks, Abhivardhan, for having me, and my hello to all my co-panelists. So India has played a very important role in the development of the concept of Indo-Pacific. The shift from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific is credited by many to the rise of India. How India's rise basically led to the Indian Ocean region becoming more dynamic, led to the sort of increase in volumes of trade passing through the region, the sheer numbers of people who live in India, the military might, the economy, all of that made sure that India is not really just kept out of important geopolitical discussions taking place within this region. Um, and India has, for some time, actually been very vocal on Chinese expansionism. India was one of the first countries that was consistent in opposing the BRI when others were still talking about how maybe the economic rise of China could basically lead to its democratization. That did not happen. One of the things that always gets discussed is that the Indo-Pacific vision of India lacks an economic element. Often, what gets pointed out is the fact that India chose to stay away from RCEP. However, for that, I think what would be important is that India has to also look at what goes on inside the country and economic reforms which have to be brought in. And as we've seen in the last few months, um, governments, even the ones which have a majority like the present one, find it so difficult to implement a reform agenda in India. So I think we have to look at the Indo-Pacific concept also from how development is seen within the country, and for that, I think the government has to carry out some important reforms. As far as the other regions that you mentioned are concerned, if we look at Europe, we're seeing inconsistencies between various European countries and also within European countries on issues such as China, human rights, Russia. We've seen the European Union talk about a strategic compass, wherein they talk about playing an important role in the Indo-Pacific, but they also don't want the attention to go away from Russia, and they don't want the NATO to become irrelevant. If we look at East Asia again, we're seeing countries like Japan, South Korea, and blocs like ASEAN um, looking at the question of China from two perspectives: security and economy. So all those questions would be important in the years to come till 2030, which would define how the Indo-Pacific takes shape. I'll leave it at that for my initial remarks.
Yeah. Surya, you can go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Abhivardhan. I think it's a great discussion that you're hosting, and hello to everyone on the panel. Uh, one of the key aspects I think of what India would be looking to do going forward in the Indo-Pacific, I think it would be to create a network of interdependencies as much as possible, where India is a key node, if not one of the important nodes in this network. When you talk about an international rules-based order, it's something that India would want to kind of contribute to shaping in many ways. So when you look at economic, strategic, and military interdependencies, India must be able to identify key areas wherever it can create these interdependencies and kind of get in there through engaging on a bilateral basis and through a multilateral basis with a number of countries. We've started to see that to some extent with, for example, Maldives, Mauritius, Seychelles, some of these countries in small countries in the Indo-Pacific. You also see, obviously, with Sri Lanka to some extent, and I think that India will eventually start moving more eastwards in their approach when they look at, for example, the Philippines and BrahMos. That's a military example that we're looking at. It's also part of India's blue economy initiative, which is not often it's not talked about a whole lot, but it fits into a wider um, uh, vision, I think, that the government has of how to link up domestic infrastructure with infrastructure abroad. And through this, eventually, once the economy is not on a roll just as yet, it's coming out of COVID, but the idea is to create trade networks around, which many of which would be utilized for moving supply chains out of China into India and using those trade networks from India to the rest of the world as kind of a counterweight. Now, a lot of this ultimately rests on India's shoulders, how they're able to be able to enact these policies that are necessary to give an adequate incentive for other countries to engage with them and create these networks. A lot of it, as I think Josam had mentioned, depends on internal reform. And I think that as much as we look outside to the rest of the world, it's as much about how we fix our own problems so that we can become a credible alternative to China. And in that way, we will be able to shape the future of the Indo-Pacific. So I just leave it at that, and I'm happy to go into more details on supply chains and commodities, which is kind of my area of focus later on. Thanks.
Yes, Richard, you can go ahead. Yeah.
All right. So I think a couple of the panelists, I think Rishabh and Jyotsna mentioned, and this is an important point, that the origin of the term Indo-Pacific comes from the maritime sphere. It's the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And this is something that has not always been clear to the public who are following this geopolitically. They think, oh, it's because India is involved in the creation of this concept very deeply. But I would argue we have not been as involved as we should be in the definition of the Indo-Pacific and in pushing our interests through this platform. So it's something that has come to take up a lot of mind space and even policy space, but it's still happening passively at the Indian level, especially when you look at how the in the Quad, that the Quad is supposed to be the leading vessel of Indo-Pacific policy, be it maritime, in terms of trade and the economy, or in terms of naval and geopolitical strength. Uh, there has not been enough reflection of Indian interests in the common statements coming out of the Quad, where it's primarily Australian and US interests about a free and open Pacific Ocean, about maintaining hegemony over their trade routes, and around Chinese expansionism, which was mentioned in the South China Sea, for example. But very little comes out of Chinese expansionism in Arunachal Pradesh, or in Bhutan, or in Sikkim, or in the border with Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. Now, or Tibet, this is something that should have been brought up more strongly, that the capital in exile of Tibet is hosted by India. The Dalai Lama is uh, protected by India. And for decades, we have uh, shown ourselves to be a patron of the Tibetan cause, and yet there's not enough uh, advancement of our interests around Tibet or any of our border disputes with China, and that's surprising because of the four countries of the Quad, that's Japan, Australia, the US, and India. India is the one that has had military skirmishes with the People's Liberation Army, not just in the last few decades, but in the last few years. And it's disappointing that the Indo-Pacific concept and the Quad is being pushed by interests who are not even as deeply involved with China as we are, whereas many people in the public are just happy. Oh, it's nice that we're being included. It's not enough to be included. You should be shaping the discussions. And the wider point that you mentioned about where does Europe, East Asia, and India, where do they come together geopolitically? I'm a bit of a heretic here. I don't think there's such a thing as Europe. Europe is a social construction. There's just one mega continent, Eurasia, and traditionally it was divided between Europe, which was the Christian world, and Asia, which was anything that was Oriental, anything that was non-Christian, anything that was semi-civilized. And I think one of the best examples of that is Russia. Russia is a country that is Eurasian. It has a large proportion of its population in Europe and a large proportion of its area in Europe, and has always struggled with perceptions in the West of not being Western enough, consistently told that they're half Mongol, half Orientalist, because they're Orthodox Christian, not deserving of Western values, unable to comprehend Western values, hence not compatible with the West. That even after 30 years of the USSR collapsing, and now today the Russian Federation is hyper capitalist. It's very religious. It's very conservative. It's more uh, of a Western democracy than people are willing to admit. It's still not enough because they're still seen as Eurasians. And this is an important concept moving forward because, again, India is also a country and a civilization that has been portrayed in such terms that, oh, they're so close to being like us, but they're not enough like the West. They're still civilized, and that's why they need extra attention. So you don't see the West taking these liberties with China because China was never part of their orbit. It always made a distinction. Chinese are civilized, the rest of the world are barbarians. But India, because of its unique history of colonization, particularly mental and cultural colonization, we're seen as halfway there. So it's very important that they pull us all the way there and not let us fall back. This backsliding, as they call backsliding of democracy, backsliding of values in India. So heretics are treated with much more derision than heathens, to use that term.
Akshay, would you like to go in? Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Vardhan. Good morning, good evening to everyone from different parts of the world. I think in the construct of the Indo-Pacific, if you think about it, in the imagination of literal states, if you think about it, if you go back to the days of yore, you always had decisions on sea that affected decisions on land. I mean, to the victor goes the spoils, to the conquest go the wins go the colonizers. The British Empire began with its conquests in overseas in Asia and Africa. And in the geopolitical understanding and a very Western world understanding, the construct were always towards the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, right? And even post World War II, we heard about the importance of transatlantic nations and transatlantic partnerships, and and it's also where Britain at that time saw itself in the world, and and apropos of the recent James Bond movie that came out, the reason why the James Bond films were a cultural success is also where Britain saw itself as this key bulwark, a Western ally in the Cold War era. But with the sense of, maybe Richard alluded to, Europe sort of fading away in the geopolitical heft. That, of course, has taken out that sense of importance of the Atlantic Ocean. And of course, now the Indo Pacific, of course, being codified partly from the Indian Ocean. And you think about it really, if you think about the origins of the Quad, which sort of came about in 2004, post 2004, after the Indian Ocean tsunami, 2007 relief work. But even then, it didn't get any traction. There were no takers for it in 2008. India, of course, following a strict policy of strategic non-alignment. Japan, with its own hesitations of history, wanted to stay away from anything that was seen security-esque, even though the Quad almost feels like almost someone trying to prove its identity that it wasn't security-esque at that point. And then also Australia was a key part, because who was in charge then? Kevin Rudd, the fluent Mandarin speaker, and of course, was very influential in opening up Australia's Asia Pacific understanding, and didn't want upset China. And you have to go back to understand that in 2008, why Australia is repeatedly called the lucky country, according to 1964 masterpiece by Donald Horn, is Australia avoided recession in 2008, because while the rest of the world was suffering from the subprime crisis, China's boom meant Australia's commodity market had a direct market, and as a result of which, Canberra didn't want to irk Beijing, which of course, those chickens have come home to roost now. But so that's sort of what the Quad's history was. But then from 2008 to 2017, what's happened? It's almost like, it's not like one fine day the Quad woke up and they're like, let's do something. Yes, they may seem like it, but fundamentally, the elephant in the room is always a dragon, the China. And what you think about it is, Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping's China have been far different, right? I mean, Deng Xiaoping had this whole philosophy of hide your strengths and bide your time and hide your strengths. And you've seen more and more with Xi Jinping since 2012. There is a sense of only iron hand, no velvet glove. And I think that sort of belligerence and bellicosity has sort of almost given it the catalyst that the Quad needs. And that's also 2017. And also, what happened in 2017 is South China Sea, 9 dash line, 11 dash line, depends which way you look at it, has been fundamental, because when we talk about the Quad of these four players, a very important part of that has also been the ASEAN countries. Five of them are literal states. And also, ASEAN has always seen this Beijing sword of Damocles hanging over its head. And while we talk about ASEAN centrality in the Indo-Pacific, it's also important to know that ASEAN is also not just culturally heterogeneous, but geopolitically as well, right? On one hand, you have Singapore, which has always seen itself as a grass beneath when two warring elephants tussle. That's the U.S. and China. But on the other hand, you've got Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam, which are directly at crosshairs with Beijing's expansionism in the South China Sea, particularly in the Spratlys and the Paracels Island. But there are other countries like Thailand, right? If you look at Thailand's history, one of the few countries that's never been colonized. And it's partly due to the adroit statecraft that the monarchy always had. And Thailand's almost had nothing on Beijing, right? And it's also been quiet. You have things like Cambodia, which is relatively landlocked, which has assuaged, in the past with even Japan on whaling. Like, what would a relatively landlocked country care about whaling? It's because Japan promised infrastructure bids. And similarly, China is going to do that for Cambodia. Myanmar has been very quiet, given its border with China as well. So this is where also ASEAN centrality has not been important. Coming back to the more India question here as well. As I mentioned earlier, with the Atlantic Council waning, the sense of the Indian Ocean prominence has really come up, and that's where the Indo-Pacific. If you think about even from the U.S. lexicon, right, from Obama's pivot to Asia, it got more codified under Trump and Pompeo administration. To now the Biden administration, which was seen as to be very domestic focused in the beginning, coming in with a sense of vaccine rollouts because of the pandemic in the start of 2020, 2021, end of 2020. But even then, the Quad almost had a priority. How did the Quad, the impetus started with foreign minister level meeting, from a virtual summit to the first in-person summit, even when you had a sitting duck president, then prime minister rather, Yoshida Suga, coming, because it almost wanted to kind of now make it a more codified thing and not just something in practice. Um, Fundamentally, I think what's helped the Quad is AUKUS. People think that AUKUS is sort of going to be countering the Quad, but what AUKUS is a directly a tri-pact military alliance. It takes Britain in the Indo-Pacific, and it kind of helps the one alibi that the Quad felt it never had, that we are not a military alliance, we're not a military pact, because it fundamentally is more important for Tokyo and New Delhi. Tokyo, given its aversion to be seen with anything nuclear, based on its own hesitations of history, and India's, of course, this strength of strategic autonomy, this strength of this Vasudeva Kutumbakam kind of philosophy that's been codified and almost spoken about ad nauseum. And I think with AUKUS coming in, it kind of bifurcates it. It's almost like splitting up a company and making it two different subsidiaries. Where, and of course, ironically, that while we may see on one hand the diplomatic maneuver, it also had repercussions in Paris, but that topic for another day. Um, because it's nuclear submarine, very very security focused. The Quad can now accentuate what it's about: vaccine rollouts, critical new emerging technologies, resilient supply chains, and climate action and education. So it's the Quad now is seen more as like, all right, you know what, Beijing's are, you can move to AUKUS right now. We're just the good guys doing, you know the non-bad things. So I think that's sort of where I'd leave out my opening statement there, and perhaps set the ball rolling for the rest of the conversation. Thanks.
Hmm. Yeah. So this is an interesting very very interesting point made by all of you. So let me get on something which is a sub question to the first point of this panel, which is something came into my mind, and recommend all the panelists to weigh in on the same. So I understand that when the question of Europe comes in, we know that Europe is that actor which has its own ambitions. People sometimes try to claim that Europe can become the next non-aligned movement, or maybe not. That's not my claim, that's somebody else's claim. But when it comes to looking at autonomy, um, we still see that, and this we had discussed in one of our panels, that in the Russia Ukraine crisis, it was very inevitable that while countries like Croatia and Germany had a different angle to take up, in fact, when we see the statements of the Croatian president, Netherlands and certain other countries thought to go ahead and basically fulfill or maybe accentuate with the NATO mandate. But leaving that point aside for a while, um, do we see Europe being critical in that scheme of Eurasia being a very important, I would say, theater of geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific? Because there are two angles which generally will come in. First, definitely is the maritime challenge. We know whether it is the Far East, whether it is the Strait of Malacca region. Of course, within that we can add the Arctic, but the landlocked issues definitely come in and weigh in. And uh, the thing with India is that its cooperation and its own relationships with countries like Iran and the Saudis, this is somewhere down the line for India is quite okay, but I'm not sure in future how will it align in future. So let's weigh on India's multi-alignment a little bit, and let's see where it comes in. And I think then we can move on to the question of strategic autonomy in a multipolar world, because for there, what my assumption has been is that we are not in the times of uh, non-alignment anymore. This is my view. We are like more of a multi-aligned country. Our diplomats say that we are non-aligned. We say it in Europe, we say it in America, we say it in everywhere. But despite being a very key member of the NAM, we're not non-aligned. I think we are multi-aligned. But maybe there can be non-alignment 2.0. So let's go clockwise, as I had said. So we'll begin with Jyotsna, then Surya, then Rishabh, then Ruchir, and then Akshay. I'll not intervene. I think people can have a conversation dialogue. So it's in the clockwise manner, as we can see. Yeah. So Jyotsna, you can go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks, Abhivardhan. So, just on the question of Europe, like I pointed out earlier, there are divisions on several key questions, such as China, Russia, human rights. So, for example, what liberal internationalists in Brussels or metropolitan London um, would view the world is not how, say, Brexiteers or people in Eastern Europe view the world. There are divisions over issues like human rights, LGBTQ rights, on say on the China question also, we have countries like Lithuania on one side, which have recently been in trouble over the opening of a Taiwan representative office. And then you have countries like the UK, which want to play an important role in countering China at home and in the Indo Pacific. But just today, statements came from the Chancellor of Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, about preserving business interests with Beijing. On Russia as well, we saw what happened with the German naval chief, who said that it's important that Russia and Putin are respected, and that we need to get over the fixation on Russia. But at the same time, you see other Western European countries still remain very much obsessed with security interests emanating out of Russia. As far as the question of India is concerned, I think what we're going to see is that India is going to bank on its close partnership with the US until it builds its own capabilities to counter China. So, while at the same time, we will see India maintaining close ties with others, wherein Russia is important for cheap technology, France and Japan are important because they have a record of reliability. UK increasingly is important because more the merrier in the Indo-Pacific. Then countries like Vietnam and Indonesia are important as important regional partners. Also, in other theaters outside the Indo-Pacific, we are seeing India develop that kind of foreign policy of flexibility, where in the Gulf we have been responding to challenges, to changes which have been sort of brought by Abrahamic Accords and the ebb and flow in ties between the Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel bloc on one hand and Turkey, Qatar, Iran bloc on the other hand. Um, we could argue that political willingness in the last few years have brought us much closer to Israel, UAE, Saudi Arabian bloc in the last few years. If we look at smaller conflicts, such as if we look at the Eastern Mediterranean, for example, we are seeing India also deploy that kind of multi alignment, flexible approach to foreign policy, where we are looking at interests in our relations with countries like Greece and Turkey. Um, I think one thing which was pointed out by Akshob as well, we keep talking about ASEAN centrality towards the Indo-Pacific, but ASEAN is very divided, as is the EU. So, as is Europe in general. So, I think what gets seen here are these structural sort of limitations of these institutionalized regional bodies when it comes to the China-US question. Um, it could be that it's easier to influence these organizations, where we've seen organizations like these put out their outlooks for the Indo-Pacific, their visions for the Indo-Pacific, but there's not really much to those visions. It's a lot of words thrown in. So in that way, maybe a flexible group such as the Quad might be more effective without a secretariat, without sort of a ballooned bureaucracy in dealing with challenges as and when they show up. So yeah, I'll leave it there and let's see what the others have to say.
Yeah. So just to add to what Josna was saying, I think when we start looking at Europe as a continent now, we're looking at some major demographic shifts that are in play right now, and this ties into the economic situation of Europe and the future of Europe. You have an aging population. You have a largely deindustrialized Europe. I mean, not entirely, but it has been deindustrialized, just like how the U.S. has been over the last few decades, with a lot of manufacturing having moved to China. You see in the current energy crisis here in Europe a stark reminder to a country like Germany that it does rely on Russia for its natural gas, its energy transition, green energy transition, which is going to be long and painful, will end up, having roots in bilateral relationships with countries like Russia, or even the natural gas prices here in Europe are determined not by what Europeans pay for natural gas, but what Asia pays for natural gas, and what Russia is willing to supply under certain, geopolitical conditions. So, from what we have seen in some ways is, the COVID-19 and the last few 2 3 years 2 years has really been accelerating a shift, I think, towards countries within the EU understanding that they're no longer, even as a unit together as the EU, they're no longer a sort of potent force as they were once upon a time, or they even envision themselves to perhaps be in the future. They will not achieve that position. Therefore, you see Russia and China looking at making inroads into Europe, prying away at fissures that exist politically and economically. Um, in Russia, from the Russian point of view, I think they, to some extent, they understand that they need to create a buffer zone because the U.S. has inched perhaps too far for their comfort to their doorstep. From the Chinese perspective, they already have, Italy on the BRI. They're looking at other countries, for example, Hungary, to build a university out there. They have strong trade relationships with Germany and the UK. Um, and what I see is a weakened Europe in the future, and also a major divide between the North and the South. Um, the we've seen what has happened to Greece, having been on years of austerity. We saw concerns raised in Italy during the early part of the pandemic about the EU and how and what kind of role Germany should be playing in the EU and other countries should be playing in the EU going forward with respect to Italy. So you'll see a more factionalized Europe. I think that's essentially one aspect of it. When we start looking more on the from the point of view of what India's alignments will be across the world and Europe in particular, I think that you'd be looking at several axes developing. One that I personally hope develops is a France, India, Japan axis. Um, I think that you have relatively low cost lending, perhaps from Japan. They have structurally low interest rates. They can afford to finance military expansion across not just their own military expansion, but across a network of countries, as long as it is in their longer term interests. From India's perspective, financing is obviously very important. From the French perspective, as their submarine deal kind of sank, you now look at them looking for other partners, and they see that India is potentially a partner which will build on its previous relationships, that previous deals that it's done with it, whether it's with Rafale or in other areas as well. Look at nuclear energy. They want to build this up into a stronger partnership. Now, if these three countries are able to get something in line where they're able to have a common vision, at least a common minimum program of what they want to achieve in the Indo-Pacific, it could be quite interesting, because France is not a country which would seek, in my view, would seek the sort of hegemony that the United States or China would want to they envision for themselves in the future. I think that working with countries which have similar interests, working on transfer of technology, using your country's market and the economic opportunity to draw in investors who are not likely to turn against you. These are things that India must be looking for in their as they develop different partnerships across the world. The point that Akshay mentioned about um, working with the U.S. as well, and I think that this has been a discussion for a while. Dependency on the U.S., I think, for developing our security architecture at least to some extent when we're looking at countering China. I don't think that's necessarily something that will happen 100%, because I think our relationship with Russia is very is key, and the U.S. is halfway across the world. Geography matters. Um, uh, Russia is not interested in a unbridled expansion of China across the whole of Asia. They are looking for to keep things in check. The corridor from Russia through the Central Asia into Iran, connecting up through to Chabar and into India, will be an example of that. They want to consolidate their interests also in the region. They don't want this to, and India has to plug into other countries' interests, like Russia's interests or Iran's interest for that matter. Iran will play an interesting role, because here they would be playing, whether it's Beijing off Moscow off Delhi. This is kind of what they may end up playing. But it's really about it's about deft diplomacy under these circumstances, to create these very strong axes which will serve our interests, to eventually create this network of interdependencies which I mentioned earlier about. Um, Working with the U.S. obviously on an economic front, I think, is exceptionally important. On a intelligence sharing, strategic front, yes. Energy partnerships, absolutely. But I would be a little wary of going too far down the route of military. Definitely not a military alliance, but I think even very, very too close military partnerships and weapons dependencies, because as we know, weapons dependencies essentially creates it completely removes your strategic autonomy in the long run. So I think that's something that India is obviously quite aware of and will continue to pursue in that way.
Great. Rishabh, yeah.
Yeah, I think very one point which I would like to just highlight. Um, India France relationship, I think, is, as Surya pointed out, very important. Remember, the French are going to take over the presidency of the EU, right? Not just that. I mean, you also have to remember that France is the chairman of the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium and the Indian Ocean Conference. So, I mean, they are a resident power of the Indo-Pacific anyway. But yeah, I would say that to some extent, one thing is correct, that if, I mean, right now we are having a discussion about how we are interdependent or dependent on Russia, right? So much so that in an immediate conflict, right? If Russia wants, it can cripple us in a way that we will not have spare parts to actually have a sustained conflict, right? So in that sense, I would say, I mean, if you're talking about, if you're questioning the fact that we may not be able to rely on Russia, if in case, let's say, this whole dragon bear narrative takes place, and there is almost a de facto military alliance between Russia and China, then I don't know how much can we rely on the United States and the Quad, so to say. One thing I think which bothers me, or which has bothered me in the recent past, is the kind of dilution uh, of the Quad. And I wouldn't say, a lot of people say that this dilution is, in some sense, is because of AUKUS. I actually disagree. I don't think it's about AUKUS. And I personally, as much as I've read and the different analysis that I've come across, uh, AUKUS is not a very, something which is coming in the short term, right? The submarine deal, etc., is going to take a very long time. It's going to definitely take 5 to 10 years. So I really am not a big at least for now, in the next 5 6 years, I don't think AUKUS playing that much of a part. But AUKUS did start a debate in India, and AUKUS is one thing where our big wigs of Indian foreign policy are still very divided, right? If you see, for example, some of them have actually said that this is actually Washington's signal to Delhi that they are not placing their bets only on India, right? And that kind of tells you, kind of gives shape to this narrative that India has to look elsewhere and kind of get it act together. But my concern is not that Quad is being diluted because of AUKUS or Washington looking elsewhere. I think, for me, is it's the messaging, I think, has gone off in the last few years. Somebody talked about, I think, vaccines. I mean, what happened to that? Nothing. Supply chains, nothing, zero, right? I mean, there could have been some movement here and there. I remember United States has or did start a very effective vaccine you know uh, giving different countries vaccine in Africa, in Asia, even to Pakistan, etc., which is fine. But I don't think that was under the Quad, umbrella, so to say. So there has been this shift, right? There has been a lot of talk about how it is not an anti-China. We're not excluding, and I understand why that is. How you have to be diplomatic. Niceties have to be there. But I think in the recent times, a lot of people have said that, oh, this is not a military alliance. First, it started with, this is not just a military alliance. Then Anthony Blinken came out and said, this is not a military alliance. This is just a like-minded countries, who are going to reaffirm the global, or at least the Indo-Pacific and the rule-based order in the Indo-Pacific, etc., etc. Uh, and then, slowly, I think to some extent, I won't say it's a talking shop. I know a lot of people who are vehement critics of Quad suggest that it's a talking shop. I won't go that far, but I would say that there is a kind of a disconnect, I feel. And I think it's happening because I remember the Indian Army chief. He said that yes, it's not a military alliance, but it actually, one of the very important parts of the Quad is actually military cooperation, right? And if you look at it from that perspective, I mean, even if we don't want to, or as analysts or experts say, this is not about excluding China, or this is not about excluding anyone, right? Mainly trying to assuage Russia's concern. Ultimately, I mean, an average Indian looks at it and thinks that it is about military, right? What the hell is, I mean, ultimately it is the China threat, the immediate China threat, that what we're concerned about here, and we expect United States to some extent, at least that's a general conception, right? That United States will come to rescue, and it has helped us in many ways. But I will say that the recent, the shift to this non-security, traditional, non-traditional, human security challenges, and I understand these things are important, but I think the messaging has been a little off. And if, for example, there is an invasion, or even if there is not an invasion, I would say that with all that's happening in Ukraine right now, there there is no denying, that a lot of people in Asia are looking at the United States and thinking, how much are they actually concerned, or how much are they focused on the Indo-Pacific anyway, right? Uh, One point I think I would disagree. I think Ruchir, pointed out about how much they are doing, or what the Indo-Pacific is doing, with regards to what's happening on India border, especially with vis-a-vis China. I think India itself would not want anybody to come near that, right? So I mean, think about it. A lot of people, a lot of experts have talked about how you know uh, it presents a very big concern if Russia invades. What is India's stand? What is India going to say, etc., etc. I think if you look at it closely, here is China, right, who's kind of encroached upon our land, right, made multiple ingresses, continues to provoke, and here we are. We're not asking for any military assistance. Well, we're asking for military assistance, but we're not asking anybody, to mediate or get directly involved. We are basically sitting down and talking to them for 20 rounds, right? More than that, right? So I would say that on that front, I don't think India expects Quad, so to say, to actually, help us directly in our conflict with China, or especially on our borders. I think more on that front. I think bilaterally, I think India and most Indians would want the United States to do more on, let's say Pakistan, for example, right? Because I think there is this conception in United States, or at least some people, I think in Washington D.C., that the onus to hold this together, right? The onus is on India to prove itself worthy to be seen as a reliable partner, and I don't think that's entirely very fair. So on that part, I think India should stay clear out of Ukraine, and whatever happens there. I think you have to remember that someone suggested, I think very prominent person who suggested that India has to make a choice. India has to face consequences, and I would say, of course, India has to make choices, and India will face consequences if there is indeed a Russian invasion. But then we don't really have to make a choice right now, especially if when the invasion hasn't even happened, right? So if you look at it, somebody pointed out Europe is not just divided. I would say that even within Ukraine, I mean, if you see the U.S. Ukraine, if you look at how they're debriefing their media, for example, there have been a lot of rumblings coming out of Ukraine, within Ukraine officials and U.S. officials. I mean, yesterday, Ukraine officials were being blamed by American press and some Biden officials, unofficially saying that he's downplaying the threat, right, etc., etc. And then the deputy defense minister comes out and he says, that's not true. That's just a part of psychological warfare. Let's not create panic, etc., etc. And I actually was seeing a Vice report last night, and I saw the foreign minister. He says this, and I think this is very important. He says, you know, uh, Putin, we shouldn't allow Putin to get what he wants without even crossing the border. What he's basically saying is that if you kind of inflate this threat of imminent invasion, right, you kind of create such a panic, right, which will hurt the Ukrainian economy. It's already in tatters, right? So it will actually further weaken Ukrainian economy to some extent. It's already created a lot of panic in the people, and it doesn't do anybody any help, right? When it comes to NATO membership, they talk about open door policy. They never actually deny it, right? I mean, the president came out and said, you know what, you guys, even the president of Ukraine came out and said, you have to tell us, right? So I think when all this is happening, there's so much of division within Europe. There is a disjointed, response towards what's happening right now. Uh, I mean, look at what happened with, somebody pointed out, with Germany. I mean, also one more point. France has been able to, France has sent some troops, etc., to some for forward deployment in some country. I don't actually remember which one, but remember, France has been able to do this because France is very energy dependent, right? Independent, right? It's not dependent on Russian gas as much as, for example, Germany is. And I would say that, when you're talking about when you talked about European powers and their role in Indo-Pacific, I don't think Europe will be or EU will be a big factor in Indo-Pacific. I think European states would be by themselves, independently be important factors. And here I think France's role will become more important. Uh, and again, just to reiterate this small perspective that, if there is an expectation of from others that India has to reaffirm or vocally articulate, that they are against this, etc., etc., condemn, if not condemn, but come out against Russia, I don't think that's really going to happen anyway. uh, I don't think that should happen, because remember, I mean, even if a full-scale invasion happens, right? Of course, India will up the ante, say a bit more, etc., etc. But ultimately, will it really matter? I mean, I don't know if Russians are not going to listen to all I mean, if they are going to, if they are calculating that let's go ahead with this. Even when there is so much threat of action, we'll expel you from the SWIFT system, etc. Will Russia, I mean, I don't think anything is going to happen if, India comes out or says something or doesn't say anything. I mean, I don't think that's going to happen. So on that front, I think I agree with Surya that, we have to look at European actors as independent. And to some extent, to whatever I've read of, these European declaration, the white papers, etc., there's just all talk. And again, I think it was Valina yesterday who also said this, that, I was looking at your event, and she said this. She said, we have to look at the actions. And I think on that front, if you look at real actions, right? I mean, concrete visual translation of strategic relationship, that I think, France is the best example. So yes, we have to be multi-aligned in that sense. To some extent, I would agree, and there has to be different accesses of power. uh, but I would say I think India would go for kind of issue-based alignment more than, kind of, this grand strategy kind of alignment. I don't think that's possible in a world like, you know world right now. So yeah, I think that's my main concern, and hopefully others can chip in, and we can talk about other stuff.
All right. So building on that, I think you've all brought up very important points about Europe's, let's say, willingness and ability to act in a coordinated manner in geopolitics. So at the moment, there's a reason why uh, the accession process, in new member states is always called Euro-Atlantic integration, because they want you to join the EU but also join NATO. And that is very problematic, because that means you have the European Union, which is at its core a protectionist trading bloc, which each country has joined for its own self-interest. Germany has joined it to treat the rest of Europe as its colony, as economic dependency, so a source of cheap labor, a market for finished goods, and the others, the small countries, are in it for self-interest for their financial sector. So, for example, Luxembourg or the Netherlands. New member states are in it, so in Eastern and Southern Europe, because their elites sold them out, and that leaves you, very few countries that have a big picture beyond that, because it's working at the moment for the political and administrative and business elite in these countries, especially as the European Union is outsourcing its defense to NATO, which often has the same member states but has this umbrella of the big hegemon, the US, who deploy their own troops in NATO member states. Now, this might be useful for some countries. So, for example, the Baltic states, who have great insecurity about their relationship with the Russian Federation and are very keen to have a big patron who can scare off their historical rivals. But since NATO is supposedly an alliance of equal partners, an attack on one member state is considered an attack on all, that doesn't mean that a country like Portugal has any interest in defending Estonia in case of military aggression by one of its neighbors. So at the end of the day, it's still individual nations that are acting in bilateral manners when it comes to Europe. And at the moment, any move towards an independent, European foreign policy, European defense policy, are scuttled by the existence of NATO. You can have NATO, or you can have, a clear European defense and security policy. You can't have both because the two are currently leeching off each other. Now, there are many internal contradictions within the EU and NATO, as you've all mentioned. So, for example, the Croatian president saying yesterday that NATO didn't come and liberate Croatia. We have no obligations to come to NATO's defense. Not sending a single troop to Ukraine doesn't matter, don't care. So that was refreshingly honest. Many countries believe this, then just not as bold to say it openly. But at the end of the day, you can sum up what NATO and the EU think of Ukrainian defense, which is, oh, yes, we'll fight the Russians down to the last Ukrainian. So they're not going to send their own troops to die at the border. It would be tremendously unpopular domestically, and there would be a push for reconciliation as soon as possible or diffusion of the situation. And you see that now. France, for example, the one country in the EU which has uh, what it calls the politics of grandeur. It thinks of itself as a great power. It is a nuclear power. It's part of the UN Security Council Permanent Five. They are acting to mediate between Russia and Ukraine bilaterally without involving the Americans, without involving the EU, without involving NATO. That is actually more effective than being dragged along by some belligerent member of NATO or by the big daddy of NATO who are just itching for a war. It's much healthier to have strong bilateral relations until you find yourself in a position to reform the EU to decouple itself from NATO. Now, realistically, that is being scuttled internally because there are certain countries, even with the departure of the UK, which was the biggest American lapdog in the EU and was a saboteur. I'm very glad that they left because it gives the EU a lot more maneuverability without all these British votes pushing American sabotage into the EU project. But there's still others. So the Netherlands is historically used in the same way. And you mentioned the Netherlands earlier, that they're one of the more belligerent actors at the moment, as opposed to Germany, who try to stay clear, uh, to their credit. Unlike in the past, where they were quite vocal about wanting to bomb Yugoslavia over the Kosovo crisis. So it's very difficult to see a way out of the quagmire at the moment because there are uh, member states who are very pro-American and very pro-NATO. There are some which are ambivalent and some which are trying to do their own thing with or without the EU. Now, from a realist perspective, a more effective way of organizing the European Union, both from a uh, economic and foreign policy perspective, would be to split the current EU into two tracks, where you have a Western European Union centered around France, which acts like a global superpower, and an Central or Eastern European Union on the lines of the old Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, which has a different set of security concerns, which has a different economic and social context. And without having to go through this farce of, oh, we believe in these shared European values, which, quite frankly, Hungary and Poland and Croatia don't care about. They're in it for economic gains. And even those they only have the economic gains because they didn't join the euro. If you joined the euro, you've basically killed your economy if you were one of the lower ones, because it has led to stagnation. The euro is designed for countries within the bloc who have manufacturing capacity. So specifically Germany, France, and Italy, to be able to still be competitive with China and the US when they export their finished goods. If you're a smaller country, it just means you were forced to privatize your state owned enterprises. You were forced to open up your market to imports from the big states, and you're losing all of your youth as brain drain to the West. And you're faced with an aging society. You're unable to pay pensions and are basically sleepwalking into a demographic and socioeconomic disaster. So this would be served better if you had two European unions, which are based on the unique, socioeconomic, geopolitical contexts and ambitions and insecurities that these two blocks face. So the Warsaw Pact doesn't, you can make a mini Warsaw Pact without the communism, without the Russia, simply of the old countries of the Warsaw Pact, or the new countries of the European Union, so that they can act as a common market with each other without being turned into semi-vassals or into neo-colonies of Germany, France, and Italy. And likewise, the Western European Union, the original members have always chafed that, oh, why did we even let in some of these Southern and Eastern European countries? They don't match our values, they're inefficient, blah, blah, blah. Well, good, you decouple yourselves from them. They have different ambitions as well. You want to be a manufacturing powerhouse. You have a big manufacturing base. You have these three big countries, Germany, France, and Italy. You have uh, the financial sector and oil and gas in the Netherlands, and you have Belgium for some reason, which won't exist in a few decades anyway. So who cares? Yeah, go forward with it. Uh, that's the way forward. I don't see a future with the EU as it stands being a credible or effective foreign policy player, apart from giving statements about shared values this and promoting democracy that, without any of the hard power to back it up.
Yes, Akshay, you can go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. Hopefully my microphone more clear this time. I think so. Let me approach this in two ways. One is, of course, when you think about India's strategic sense of non-alignment, which obviously, as we touched on earlier, from started off in Nam at a time of the historical perspective, of course, is still profound in the sense that on one hand, you may think of it as what we've seen as pusillanimous foreign policy, but really at that time when it really was coming into being was why would a country that sort of again suffered with hesitations of history from a sense of a British East India Company turn one set of Western faces for another set of Western faces, that is American capitalism. So ergo, this sort of the sort of first Soviet socialist structure came about, where the Overton window was at that time of Fabian socialism, this Nehruvian Fabian socialism that came about, and non-aligned movement at that time was a little ahead of its time because in the idea of the geopolitical imagination, young emerging countries really did not have a leg to stand on, right? Especially when you're talking about a bipolar, two party power block structure. It was a with us or against us long before George Bush. So people sort of had to hedge their bets one way or another. And you saw that very clearly with Pakistan earlier on. So India sort of decided to stay that. And the non-line movement, of course, has had various renditions over the year that's become this form of strategic autonomy. Um, let's get to something more pertinent and specific on Katsa, for example, right? Katsa is, of course, the flavor of the month, and every flavor of the month the last few months in Washington, D.C. So years where it is good for the strategic autonomy, years where the strategic autonomy is going to be bad. On one hand, in India's counter towards Katsa, look, let's not reset the relationship back. We've been through sanctions before with the 1998 Pokhran tests, and that's when India was still, and the United States was still sort of a sense of estrangement to now what I call engagement, right? So you move from estrangement to engagement, and India, of course, has moved from a country that was dependent on aid in from the PL 480 food subsidies from the Johnson era, which were rolled back when Indira did not support the war in Vietnam, to now a sense of trade. We're talking about trade deals with the United States, even though we're far off from what's likely to be an FTA. But that estrangement to engagement came about when these hesitations of history of term sanctions went away, right? India went from just in a very short time from the 98 sanctions to a civil nuclear deal in 0506 within under a decade. And that was phenomenal, even though India didn't have to do the CTBT and PT thing because the United States made a genuine exception for India to share civil nuclear energy and recognize a strategic partner. And this, of course, was the time of George Bush, who was also was played for a fiddle by the Musharraf administration. So it was still very seminal. And it also just kind of shows that the NATSEC administration is not also homogeneous, right? There are different ways to that. Uh, Now, what India's counter to CATS as look, India is still a strategic autonomy, so India is not obligated to buy defense from one partner. Russia, of course, has this legacy era partnership. If you look at CIPRI's identification of where India buys its weaponry from, 49%, 50 almost, is still from Russia. The others are United States, Israel, and France. Uh, that pie chart is still more or less going to stay the same for a while. And India's counter look S-400 is meant to counter against a belligerent Beijing, not even against an ally, an American ally in Pakistan, right? It's meant to counter against China, and there's an Indo-Pacific coordinated strategy to preclude Beijing's overtures. So it kind of help. And thirdly, is also where the India and the United States relationship has come so far ahead to roll back, and you don't want the naysayers of the United States, if at all, that a lot of them do exist in Delhi circles, to kind of have that ignition of saying America can't be trusted. So that's India's counter to CATSA. Furthermore, it's because Turkey, which is a NATO ally and a signatory, having procured S-400, is eligible to sanction because they're a signatory. So this is where India's strategic autonomy works for it. Where it doesn't work for it in this case is fundamentally right now. We've spoken about the build up on the Russia-Ukraine border, which almost is on one hand, I was praising the NATSEC administration. It's almost like now it's like 11 players chasing the same football because everyone now just talking about Russia, Ukraine, momentarily saying, "Oh, Indo-Pacific, China, let's put that on the hold right now." What that means is just as India is out of the woods with CATSA, uh, you while you had even senators like Ted Cruz was seen as hawkish who came up with the Crucial Act. You've had bipartisan consensus in Congress with Mark Warner and John Cornyn coming out saying, "Look, the Biden administration has to give India a CATSA waiver." Something like Russia, because of Ukraine, again, it'll again automatically just trigger that exception towards India on this may just get mitigated by a sense of belligerence. It's almost like think of it like a primary debate, guilty by association. And given the S-400 is literal surface to air missiles coming in from Moscow, the first deployment already began in Punjab, and then you already had India Russia seminal 2+2. The Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had come aboard. You had Putin recently visiting here, so uh, that what that means is with something like this, as escalation goes up, it'll kind of again all the strongest people of a CATSA waiver, like someone like Cruz, who was a wave proponent of India getting the CATSA waiver, who's also very known as a security hawk, will suddenly see this and be like, the math does not add up here. I think furthermore, I think someone touched on this earlier. Like it'll also be like we're talking about a potential energy crisis that's going to result from this. Not just because Russia has rich energy supply, but also India imports one of the largest or sunflower oil from Ukraine. So that's also going to affect India's uh, India's stance right now. So whether we like it or not, because this will have such repercussions, the strategic autonomy at some point always, while ideologically it is said to be a more profound way of thinking, the practicality of it may not always hold up, right? And this is obviously something that we can't necessarily war game a Katsa in 65. We can't war game this. You can't war game diplomacy the way you can war game what military generals can war game actual military strategy, because that a lot of it is based on various winds of change, various administrations that come in. And again, in the United States imagination, there are few adversaries that will always be there. There's Russia, that's going to be the historical adversary. There's China, that's going to be the geopolitical adversary. And there'll be Tehran and Iran, which will be like the cyclical adversary. Something on nuclear centrifuges will start, something Israel will start. And I think as long as this happens, it's where India balances out. And to close my last point out, in 2018, I had a conversation with an Indian diplomat in Washington, and he kind of said that India and BRICS prevent it from looking anti-US, with Russia and China being center court, and India and Quad prevents it from looking anti-China. And that sort of was both profound, and where India sees itself as sort of this, this paraverse, this sort of mitigating factor. But I think Galvan just changed that, right? And the Indian foreign policy think tank on that as well. China just completely snapped the olive branch, and to the point that this, we had the reset with, the Wuhan summit. You had the Mamallapuram summit, which you can coming down, and within that itself,
Did you lose his audio?
I guess. I think the audio device is not connected. Akshob, if you can just reconnect the audio device.
can you hear
Yeah.
me now? Sorry,
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead, go ahead, go ahead, go
sorry.
ahead, go
What
ahead.
was the last one you heard? I'm so sorry. I think finally my microphone went on mute. It is almost bizarre. No, clearly I made a point that Beijing probably doesn't like. But yeah, just on the last point as well. I think just
You pressed mute this time, Akshub.
actually not actually.
I think you're having some mic problems, Akshay.
Not audible. Just need to go to the cam mic section, and there's an audio option. Just check with which mic is it, so that it's not in a problem. I think, yeah.
Is it better now?
Just
Sorry.
yeah, yeah. It's better. It's better. It's better. You can go ahead. Yeah,
I don't know what's happening. I didn't touch anything. It's yeah, so
perfectly fine. Yeah.
Think we lost you again, Akshay.
It's fine. I think somebody else can go ahead. Then maybe Akshok can fix it, and then
Right. So until Akshob is actually coming back, I think we have very interestingly discussed Europe and the Euro Atlantic consideration. So I'm not getting on the question on Europe anyways to save time. So one thing which I
one.
was in,
Sorry,
you wish to,
sorry to interrupt you, Abhivardhan, and I know you want to move
hmm,
away from Europe, but I think just to touch upon what Akshok just said,
hmm,
this is something which I have been thinking, and I don't think this gets discussed a lot. So let me just like put it in just like give me a minute, right?
sure,
Um,
sure.
uh, one thing about strategic autonomy, I think a lot of people talk about autonomy. I mean, if you look at strategic autonomy, ultimately it's about the autonomy of or the choice that a country has to make in certain situations, and basically ultimately the main goal of strategic autonomy is to put your national interests first, right? And I think in the case of CATSA and the S400 fiasco, I mean, I would say that ultimately uh, the reason why India is willing to to risk even this kind of a little bit of a setback to the Indo US ties, because ultimately it needs it. And I think some in Washington have to understand the S400 is it has to be I don't know how you sell it at home, right? I understand why it will be difficult to sell at home because Russia is a very touchy issue, right? But I think when it comes to strategic autonomy, I don't. It doesn't matter what Washington or anybody else thinks on the S400, because ultimately it's something which is a dire need of the hour for the Indian military, right? So in that sense, I would say that even if you look at what happens with regards to CATSA or whatever the United States decides to do in Ukraine, or the fallout from Ukraine, how it reacts, etc., and how it coordinates with its allies and what it expects, etc. You have to understand that even US has to kind of US also will be faced with certain challenges and choices, right? It's not just India. So it's very easy to say that the ball is in India's court. You guys see how you're going to deal with it. But I don't think it really helps, because ultimately, if there are sanctions, one thing that you have to understand is that US will lose face. Also, I think there will be. I mean, we've seen in the recent past that domestic politics, really matters. I know people think that in India, foreign policy is all about the elite and elite consensus. But you see how there has been a politicization of, security matters currently in the Indian discourse as well. Imagine, for example, that US decides, or let's say the Biden administration tries but fails, and there are sanctions imposed on India. imagine the kind of furor that will happen in India, because because Modi government has, I mean, it has been criticized for the last 5 6 years that it's been putting all its eggs in one basket, right, and abandoning all these, I mean, Modi was criticized to not go to the NAM conference, for example, right, and people talk about how, oh, you're participating in Quad, etc. But what about other interests, etc., etc., right? So I'm saying, imagine if there are if there are sanctions, Modi government will be, which has invested a lot of political capital in this relationship, it will be cornered. And trust me, I mean, you know how Indian foreign policy is right now. There will be calls for, not a retaliation of sorts, but kind of like a pullback to some extent. So I think this is something which, people have to understand, in Washington as well, because if you do this, you not just embarrass the Modi government, right, put them in a corner, you also will be basically giving CPR to all these NAM enthusiasts, which think are, as somebody said in Delhi circles, are still, have that, Russia China kind of fantasy, whatever you want to call it. But all I'm saying is that, you will be the ones who will be putting them out of the ventilator, and who have been sidelined for all these years, by the, champions of, Indo-US relations. So it's not just India which has to make choices here. I think it's United States as well. And a lot of times I think there has been, a lot of people are conflating that and, making it all about India and the choices that India has to make. I don't think it's as simple as that. And I think this is something which the United States and, their policy circle has to, think about, because, if you're selling the India relationship only with regards to values, etc., etc., maybe it's time for you to rethink, because ultimately back here, right, our main concern right now is Chinese troops on our borders, right? And S-400 really helps. Simple. So, this is something I think people have to kind of, think in the United States as well.
Can I add something to that?
Okay, just a brief,
Yeah,
and then
yeah,
Akshat will
it'll be very
continue. Yeah.
quick. I'm very glad that Rishabh brought this up. There are enough loopholes in CATSA to, simply not impose the sanctions on India for buying the S-400. But the US is making a huge drama out of it as a negotiating strategy. They're going to not impose them anyway, but this way they'll create a perception that, oh, we're doing a big favor to India, and now India should be beholden to us and act in certain ways and loosen up on certain policies. That, you know is very duplicitous, and I would rather that have our Ministry of External Affairs call them out on this bluff. So, just like the Ukrainian president said a couple of days ago, just say that you don't want us in NATO, and we can move on. Yeah, so I would rather have India say that, if you're going to sanction us, just do it. We're not afraid of sanctions. The entire power of sanctions is the fear of the threat of sanctions. Once they come, they're actually quite easy to deal with because they radicalize an entire generation of policymakers and the public, and it makes countries more belligerent. So sanctions are counterproductive for the country imposing them, because it's really a sign of desperation and weakness when you don't have any soft power or power options. You impose sanctions and you antagonize an entire country for the next 20 years. We weren't badly affected by sanctions after Vajpayee's Pokhran tests, and we wouldn't be badly affected by sanctions if CATSA is imposed either. All it does is prove what many people were saying anyway within the Indian media and foreign policy establishment.
Like, imagine how stupid it will be that you want us to kind of get off, because we have this legacy partnership when it comes to defense and military equipment with Russia. And I mean, imagine you putting sanctions and actually pushing them back, pushing us back in their lap, right? So I think there has to be a little more. I don't know how they sell it at home. That's their prerogative, to be very honest with you. Of course, India should, help in whichever way they can. But yeah, ultimately, this is something that they have to do at their end.
Yep, sorry. I hope I can be heard now. It's better. Of
Go
course.
ahead, go ahead, go ahead, go ahead. Yeah,
I know,
go ahead.
yeah, just to I guess close up those points as well. I think fundamentally, I wouldn't know if this is the Overton window shift of India's foreign policy, because strategic autonomy is still very much codified and very much part of it as well. But I think what strategic autonomy has also done with India's foreign policy is this debate that I remember Surya and me having a while ago, or rather discussion was is India more of a great power, a great presence? And I think if you go back in 20th century wise, and obviously we only have history more than a speculation of the future to look at what great powers look like. And I think fundamentally is in the Mearsheimer context of great powers, when you've had the United States and the Soviet Union and now Russia or China, there's been a sense of expansionism, spreading their wings, hard power wise, more so. You saw that with the United States with more ideological things. Every time democracy was threatened or precluding the spread of communism, be it in Vietnam, Korea, Central America, and Latin America. There was a sense of protecting right from McCarthyism to precluding the spread of communism, or the Churchillian words of Iron Curtain. Only time I will quote Churchill for that. But and also in the sense of even in the Russian sense as well, with Soviet Union, be it Warsaw Pact, the Eastern Bloc, and even now, right? I mean, what fundamentally is that NATO on its corridor itself is something that's worrying. A former student of the Soviet doctrine, ensconced and meshed in the KGB way of life, and it's cyclical concerns. Similarly with China, right from forget about BRI for a minute, even though it's a hard thing to, but just otherwise, right from investments in Latin America to a military port in Djibouti to buying up Melbourne Central Business District. There's been that. And if you look at India's foreign policy beyond, say 71 Bangladesh, and 87 IPKF in Sri Lanka, which is sort of India's Vietnam, India's never really expanded itself in the same traditional way. And one would say that maybe that's a good thing, but that's inherently, one can't deracinate the strategic autonomy element from it as well. So I think that's where, if you look back and you were to kind of chronicle India's strategic autonomy, you would kind of add these points as to where it's helped, and particularly with cats as well. That's India's strongest card, saying, hang on a minute, we design our own mutual fund of weaponry and alliance partnerships, not alliances, sorry, over here. But another hand is, again, no matter what, the W43, you're with us, you're against us, is always said without being said. And that's always, and sometimes the chickens come home to roost with foreign policy as well. And we saw that for 50 years in the subcontinent, right? Because what the Ayub Khan era military strategic thinking in Rawalpindi at that time was, essentially like, hang on a minute, and, in India not aligning with the United States, this is our chance to snap up at it. And of course, that was followed by Eisenhower Dulles era miscalculations, and that just went on with, again, Nixon, Kissinger, multiple miscalculations, of course, which is still reeling from today in Washington. So that's where I'll kind of, I know this is a hard topic to pack for a small session, but I'll leave it there for now for strategic autonomy.
Can I just add one very quick point? Is that fine?
Sure, sure,
Yeah.
sure, 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 sure.
I think that when we look at strategic autonomy, we need to look at it from the perspective of, a time horizon, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Obviously, our predictability factor starts reducing the further out we go. But I think that you need to have a vision of what you want envision to do with your strategic autonomy under various scenarios in the immediate and future and further out. um, you know, for the next 5 years, you can imagine that there will be pressure from China on India at the border. I don't think this is something that's going to disappear anytime soon. That's factored in now into foreign policy calculations. To counter that, India is obviously working with a range of partners, uh, principally the United States on military intelligence and sharing, and also I think that uh, alongside this, they're working on indigenization of military capabilities and equipment manufacturing. I think that is, when you look at pretty much any great power, as you're talking to, back to going back to Akshov's point, a great power, a great presence. If you want aspire to become a great power, you need to have a very high percentage of your military equipment is indigenously made. Now, this will take, I think, that fits in within the 20-year time horizon, really. Now, 5 years, you start doing this, but by 10 years, from between by 10 years, you probably would have an indigenous fifth generation fighter jet. You need to be having the capabilities to mass manufacture these sort of technology platforms, military platforms. You need to be having fighter bombers like how the Chinese have. India does not have long range bombers. It needs to be having nuclear submarines. Will it get some of its technology through a relationship with France? Would it have its own jet engines through perhaps a transfer of technology? I think ultimately we have to look at how the Chinese have developed. And I'm not going to say that India must develop along the same lines as China has done so far, but there are many learnings considering it's a country of a similar population, and also is dependent on natural resources from outside. Uh, India does not need to be hamstrung by the same issues that China has been hamstrung by. Um, I think when India looks at how it wants to develop, I think indigenization of military capabilities, development of critical technologies, and mass manufacturing of them can come only if there is an element of transfer of technology, which the Chinese benefited from. We have to remember that when trade opened up with China, high-end technologies were sold to the Chinese in return for cheap goods. And the Chinese essentially just unpackaged everything, reverse engineered it, like how they did with even Russian equipment. And the Russians were not particularly happy with it, but ultimately China grew to the point that they still depended. Now Russia depends on China to some extent, right, in certain spheres. Now the Americans eventually, I mean, over the last 4 decades, they gave technology to the Chinese through and that technology was reverse engineered, and it's been weaponized in the military space, and also it's been used for civilian purposes, to sell products back to the United States, which we all consume, right, on a very basic level. So when India is wanting to engage with the world, it needs to consider its free trade or different types of trade agreements in context of what China actually got in return for providing cheap goods. Transfer of technology, I think, is absolutely essential if we want to further our interests as a nation, and if we want to develop a serious strategic economic heft in the future. So, um, and I think that the point that Akshay mentioned about not expanding beyond our borders, I think that's obviously important. We want to be seen as a benign power, which we really, in many senses, are. But I don't think that being seen as a benign power should be conflated with being with being willing to become a subservient power. I don't think we should be. I think that's what India is also struggling with to some extent, and the U.S. is also trying to see where they can put pressure to see where India might be able to kind of toe the line into perpetuity, not for a short term. Once you get American military platforms integrated into your system, you are perpetually dependent on the United States until you're able to, take a write down on all the costs, billions of dollars that you've spent. One of the reasons that the American fighter jets have not been bought by the military in India is because there's a sense of discomfort that if you're plugged into that platform, you are into perpetuity subservient. Now, that is not something that India would like. Joint technology development, on the other hand, I think that's very productive, right? It benefits both parties. It also benefits the United States when they start looking at India as a counterweight to China. But one last point, as before I wrap up, I think a lot of what we see in the Indo-Pacific and what India's alignment, as well as America's alignment in this region, is going to be like, will be dependent on whether we see an acceptance of a G2 world in Washington. In many ways, from 2005, from when Brzezinski came up with this, this concept, and it kind of floated around DC. I think Obama was willing to accept in some ways that this is kind of the future that we see for the world. Right? That was when China was a 4 trillion economy. They, in some ways, they thought that okay, in the future we'll have to carve up the world into two spheres of influence. We are in many ways seeing this today. There's been a tacit admission of this, and it's very unfortunate in many ways that you see the bipartisan consensus that you need to start cutting tariffs on Chinese goods in the United States. Inflation has gone out of control. There's been no serious move to shift supply chains out of China into other countries. Um, there have been some measures taken, of course, but what we see, I think that we will probably end up seeing a soft containment of China, where India plays a role. It is not going to play the pivotal role in this, but and geostrategically, but it will play a role. Now, that is against the backdrop of accepting that we have a G2 world. Does India necessarily believe that we have to have a G2 world? I don't think so. I think, if you believe that you are a country, as a country of 1.4 billion, you can replicate what China has done in terms of economic success over the 20-year horizon that I was talking about. 10-year horizon with 6 trillion, 20-year horizon with 12 trillion. Then you are in that league. You are not looking at a G2 world, you're looking at a G3 world, right? So, and just imagine, Europe was sidelined in 2005 by the United States when they talked about a G2 world, because they see what demographics do. They see the long term of what Europe is capable of. Now, India, where does it want to sit on this, in this world? And can it develop its own platforms? Can it develop its own capabilities? I think this comes down to political will and reforms, going back to the very fundamental problem that India faces. Can it fix its own problems to get to the point that it can assert itself in international relations, to the point that it can make other countries do what it wants them to do? Not to the point that it has to be belligerent, absolutely not, but get other countries to fall in line, right? I'd just like to leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah. And I'll say with the utmost humility that we have exceeded the 1 hour 30 limit, as we always do historically. But I think this panel deserves a second round of discussion. So, beyond Glucon, we'll definitely have a discussion for Global Hint in the coming weeks. But I think we'll then specifically focus on strategic autonomy, which is the hard point we have been discussing for a while now. But I think it has been an interesting discussion because we have covered most of the important points. We have covered Europe, we have covered Turkey, we have covered Russia. So I guess that we have concluded reasonably. So I would just ask Jyotsna to give her concluding remarks because I think rest of the panelists have spoken a lot. So I'll just offer her an opportunity to just quickly conclude of how has she deciphered as how the panelists have said, and then we'll just conclude. Yeah.
Thank you, Abhivardan. Just very briefly on the point made on the importance of domestic politics, I think it's important to look at how adversaries are sort of using channels within democracies to undermine some of our interests. So here, and it's important to look at how, for example, in open societies, it gets more and more difficult and complicated to make choices on foreign policy issues, on economic security issues, primarily because of this use of sharp power by some of our adversaries, such as China. Whereas on the other hand, China is seeing a completely opposite trend where they are closing to the outside world and to outside influences. And I think it's something that deserves a bit more scrutiny on how that impacts decisions on foreign policy, on strategic autonomy, without really sort of exaggerating the importance of it. So just that.
And I promise we will have a second round of discussion because I was fascinated by it, and there was some really interesting pointers I will keep noted, and we will have a global hint episode. We'll do it. So that's going to happen. So I thank Jyotsna, I thank Surya, I thank Rishabh, I thank Abshom, and I also thank Ruchir for his surprise presence for this flagship panel of Glacon 2022. We conclude, and I declare as the president of Glacon that Glacon is concluded for this year. Next year, we'll come up with another Indo-Pacific perspective, 6 panels, 5 panels. I don't know. Our team will declare later. Till then, Namova, and let's hope that a bright Indo-Pacific is awaited. Till then, thank you so much.